This is what my iPhone 5 housing used to look like, and this is what it looks like now. If you're a fan of phone mods or you're looking for help with a repair, be sure to check out my channel and hit the subscribe button if you want to be notified of new videos as they're released. Alright, let's check out the transformation. So you can see our new housing there on the right hand side. We will power off the device first. And I'm going to set that over here for a minute. We got the two pentalobe screws on the bottom. Of course, if you already know how to take your phone apart or at least remove the screen, you can skip ahead. I'll put some notations here in the video so that you can just click on that button. If you're viewing this from a computer, if you're on a mobile device or a tablet, just check the video description. You can take some shortcuts here if you want to get past this. I usually use a razor blade to open up the screens on the iPhone 5 series. You can use an nice SMO, suction cup, whatever works for you. But if you go in here with the razor blade, there's a pretty safe spot where you can just get between the plastic frame of the display and the metal housing. And then of course, once you do, you want to switch over to a softer tool. At least I would recommend that you do. Of course, on this housing, we really don't care if it gets dinged up or anything because we're going to be replacing it. But do make sure that you're prying between the outer frame that goes around the glass and the metal of the housing. You don't want to separate the glass from that plastic thing that goes all the way around the outside of it. So once you have that opened up a little bit, just kind of slide it down towards the bottom end of the phone, lift this up, make sure that your display does not snag on the rear facing camera. And we're going to kind of prop this up because we don't want those cables that are attached to the display to have any stress placed on them. Then we're going to take out these three screws here so that we can access the battery terminal and disconnect the battery. That's always the thing that you want to do as soon as possible. We don't want any electricity flowing through the device while we're working on it. Also, you're going to have to be very careful. I'm using some nylon tweezers here to remove these panels. Keep in mind there are a lot of components mounted on the logic board inside the phone that are very sensitive. So if you pry too far or you push too hard with something or you have a screwdriver or another sharp object and it slips, it's very easy to cause permanent damage. Of course, if you're not feeling confident about this, have someone else do it for you. I'm going to disconnect the battery here and you'll see that just kind of moves over a little bit. And the next thing we want to do is get this display off of the housing. Fortunately, we won't have to do much with the display other than disconnect it. There are three screws up here in this retaining panel. The one that I'm working on first there, you have to grab with tweezers because it will not stick to a screwdriver. We'll get these other two out, and then this kind of slides towards the battery just a little bit to disengage the hook that's on the inner part of it. And sometimes these get a little sticky because of the adhesive that's on the back of the connector cables. So you see that one actually stuck to the panel or not. So we'll disconnect these 1, 2, 3 cables. The third one you'll see here in just a second. And once you do that, we can set this aside. You don't need to do anything else to the display. You do want to take the SIM card out because it runs through the housing into the logic board, which we're going to remove, along with everything else inside the phone. So this is going to be kind of a long video. There's a lot to this, but I was really happy with the results. It was worth the time. It took a good hour to get this conversion completed, a little bit more actually, running the camera and everything, but it came out looking really clean. Everything fits well. I hope that if you buy one of these, it fits just as well as this does. You can see I'm getting the antenna wire disconnected. This one's a little bit tricky. Again, be very careful poking around in here. You don't want to cause any damage, but you need to be able to lift up on that connector so that it unplugs from the logic board. And then I kind of bend these out of the way so they're not going to be inhibiting you from removing the logic board from the phone. And this little tab right here is pretty worthless. You will have to disconnect your interconnect cables here because there is a board screw that's hidden kind of right underneath them towards the middle, which you'll see here in just a second. So we're going to have to be able to get to that screw right in there. You don't have to unplug these from both ends, but if you want to, you can. They're pretty easy to reconnect when you get done. I'm going to go ahead and take this panel off up here towards the top end of the phone. All of these screws are just about all of these screws are going to be different sizes, so make sure that you keep everything well organized. There's no real key to figure out where this stuff goes other than trial and error. And if you put a screw in the wrong hole, you can have some serious damage occur to the phone. So we'll lift this panel up. That comes out. And we've got a threaded barrel in here that you'll have to take out with a special screwdriver. You can actually do it with the very small slotted Phillips, but I prefer to use the correct driver. This is a standoff screwdriver, and this is a new one I bought. It's from Baku, however you say it. And I have to say, I'm not really very happy with it. I bought a different style here that's got a much longer center point that goes down, and it just gets into smaller areas and works a lot better. So even though it doesn't look as nice as the other screwdriver, it certainly works better. This is the flash for the camera, and there's a little cable there that's kind of crimped, and it tends to almost get in the way of this other screw that we need to get to that releases yet another panel that's going to come out of the phone. And sometimes they don't like to come out. So you can kind of pry the flash out of the area where it sits, and that'll allow you to bend this back so you can get to that screw a little bit easier, and then of course release the panel that's underneath it. I'm going to take out these board screws. These are Phillips. I'm using a PH000. And we have another board screw here, and then two down right next to where the battery plugs in. And then we've got two antenna wire or antenna screws up there at the top, you'll see here momentarily. And of course, this screw will not stick to a screwdriver either. At least it shouldn't. If it does, it probably got mixed up or somehow became magnetized. This is our main control flex cable here for the volume and the power buttons. That's got to be disconnected from the board. Make sure you do not forget that one. And I'm kind of just plugging this back in so it stays in place. It's probably, overall, I think it's easier probably just to take the interconnect cable out of the phone, depending on how well it's sitting inside. So you've got two screws way down here at the top. They're kind of towards the center of the top end of the phone, and it's a bit of an awkward angle to get in there, but you should be able to with a Phillips screwdriver. Take those screws out. Make sure you do not forget this step. I've seen people tear these cables because they just completely forgot. There's also going to be an antenna wire on the back side of the logic board, so don't get too far ahead or you can easily damage that wire if you don't anticipate what's going to happen next. So before you ever take anything out, make sure you take a good look at what you're working with. From here, we can lift the board slightly from the bottom. Make sure you kind of maneuver around all these cables. And I'm going to flip it over towards the battery so that you can see what's underneath it. And there's not a whole lot of slack for this antenna wire. So make sure that you're very careful when you turn this over. We've got to disconnect that wire right there. If you break it, it's not a big deal. I want to say that's the Wi-Fi cable. You can buy a complete replacement cable and wire. It's all one piece. It's just that you've got to pull the whole board out to get to it and a few other things. So it's kind of a headache if you end up having to replace that one. Of course, now would be the time to do it because we're going to get to that anyways. You'll see this tab right here is pretty worthless. You can try pulling on it. More than likely, you'll just tear it off right there. It goes underneath the battery, but it doesn't do a lot of good as far as removing the battery unless it's already been taken out before. So if you take a standard credit card or room key, you can get under the battery. Make sure you stay between that main control flex cable at the top and the other battery cable down towards the bottom. You've got just the right amount of space to kind of go in the position that you can see right here. And if you work your way across very slowly, you should be able to pry and pull on the battery a little bit without bending it too much. That's what you really want to avoid. If you don't rupture the cells, it's not usually going to be a problem. But I would try to avoid bending the battery as much as possible. Once you get the battery out, we're going to go ahead and remove the charging port from the bottom. There are quite a few screws that need to come out here, so I'm going to speed things up and try not to bore you to death. These are all different size screws. Well, there are different sizes of screws down here, so again, please be sure that you keep them in order. There are also some very small washer type pieces underneath the charging port. You'll see when we lift it up. So you'll want to take notice of where those are located. They're on the 4 center charging port screw holes. This little thing right here has got some adhesive on the back of it. So you see I was kind of lifting it from the side. It wasn't really getting very far. So more than likely you're going to have to apply some heat and very, very carefully pry underneath this cable. If the phone's been taken apart before, they tend to come right out, but this one apparently was not. So just take your time and do not tear this cable. It's going to fold up towards the top end of the phone, and it is stuck onto the speaker at this point. Okay, so you see I kind of release that and it folds over just like that. And at this point we should be able to go ahead and remove the speaker from the bottom end. And that will give us a little bit more adhesive on that thing. That'll give us access to a few other things on the charging port that we need to be able to get to. So you're going to have adhesive underneath this cable at the bottom. So I'm going to apply a little more heat, make this easier to remove. Yes, you can use a blow dryer. It will take a little bit longer, but I highly recommend warming this up to about 90-100 degrees. It just makes the adhesive so much easier to work with and so much less likely to tear. But take your time here. If you do tear one of these, they're pretty inexpensive to replace, but of course you don't want to have to go through any extra steps. And you'll see it kind of pulls the lightning port and the headset jack are stuck down in the bottom end of the housing, so you kind of have to work them away from the bottom end of the phone, just very gently. And there's a rubber boot where the microphone is. If you can see right next to the headset jack, we're going to have to just kind of help guide that away from the plastic that it interfaces with right there. So just pull that back a little bit. And now we should be able to take the charging port out of the phone, and we will set that aside. You can see the entire cable up here is attached to a whole bunch of fun stuff. This is kind of the pain of this phone, is working with, and there are some other components here you can see I'm pointing out. And one of those little silver things just fell out because I started turning the housing upside down. So you'll have 4 of these, and they go on the center of the charging port area. They're really tricky to pick up because they're so thin. A lot of times you can just kind of press your finger on top of them to pick them up, but they're a little awkward to work with. I'm not sure exactly what they do, but we always try to put everything back where we found it. So down at the bottom of the phone, you're going to have a couple plastic pieces that need to come out for the microphone and the speaker. And the trick to this is try to get the piece off of the frame with the adhesive that attaches it. This will just make your life a little bit easier. You can cut some adhesive to stick these back on in the new housing if you have to, but you'll never be able to get the same shape that the factory adhesive has because they're cut so thin and so small. So do try to take that off with the part all at once. These will survive without the adhesive as long as you can hold them in place long enough to get the foam put together, but I really recommend that you kind of make sure there's something sticky to hold them in place. It just will make your life so much easier. So we've got one we're going to stick right down there, and you can kind of see by looking at the housing where they're supposed to go. Now we've got one other one in the center that I had to start with a razor blade, and it was a pain to get this thing off. It took me a little while working on it, but I was fortunate enough to get the adhesive to come off with the part, so we can just transfer that straight across. And there's kind of a little flap that goes down against the inside of the housing. As you can see, I'm kind of pushing it into place there. Now we got one more piece down here from where the speaker is located that needs to be transferred over. Again, working with the razor blade to get beneath the adhesive. And if it's still sticky, we can reuse it. And this little mesh piece will keep debris from getting inside of your speaker. As you know, speakers contain magnets, so they attract all sorts of little metallic objects from the atmosphere, and you don't want that inside your speaker. These are the other little, I believe, part of the antenna mechanism that need to come out. So there's 4 of them total that go around the outside of the phone, 2 on each side. You take off 2 screws, pull these out, and then just transfer them over to the new housing. Pretty simple for these. Now we get to deal with the fun part. The strange thing about this is that you got a screw there that comes out for what goes behind the power button to hold it in place. However, you cannot open this up while you have the microphone at the top there in the way because it impedes. You'll see shortly. I'm going to get underneath this cable right now just to kind of work it away from the housing so that there's no adhesive holding it in place. And then we've got a little cushion adhesive thing here that comes off. Peel that off, and we're going to put that into the new housing once we move the button over. And you see this thing, it would normally kind of move downward because there's a hinge up at the top right hand corner of the phone, but it can't because we've got stuff in the way. So I'm going to move over here to the motor. You've got 3 screws that come out to release this little assembly here that holds it into place. And we'll lift that out, set it aside, and then we can work on getting these cables out. So we've got a few screws here down the side for the volume control cables and the silent buzzer switch. And that will allow us to kind of pull them away from the frame. But remember, we've got adhesive holding this stuff down, so we can't really go too far with it just yet. But you can see how that comes away from the housing. And we've got to kind of work up underneath the top end here. We'll apply some heat so we can get this Wi-Fi antenna out of the housing. And there you go. That's a piece I was talking about earlier. If you end up breaking that antenna wire, you can just replace that entire piece. Now we need to peel this off up here at the top where the contacts are for the motor. Always want to use something that's not sharp, so these plastic pry tools often come in handy. And you can see if we actually lift up to where the microphone is no longer against the rear housing, now we should be able to pull that hinge down. However, it looks like I decided not to do that for some reason. We need to get the housing for the flash out of the phone first of all. All right, set that aside. Do not lose this piece. You're going to need it. We're also going to salvage the flash lens from this OEM housing. The one that came with the new housing just did not fit the way that I had hoped it would, and it actually looked a little bit foggy, so I ended up taking the flash cover out of this phone. So here you see you can kind of move this hinge down. And if you lift the microphone off of the back housing, you'll be able to open the hinge. So it's kind of a strange maneuver that you have to make to get this thing undone. So now we finally got the power button switch out of the housing, and that little pin that it hinges on up in the top right hand corner, I have not been able to figure out how to get that thing out. So if anyone knows how, please post a comment, because I just end up replacing them whenever I do these. I don't know what holds them inside. I think maybe you have to take the glass off of the back side of the phone to get to them, but I did not have any luck removing it. So here is your power button volume control flex cable. Here's your silent buzzer switch. Note that the red is facing the front of the phone when we put it back into the housing, just like that. Don't want to get that upside down. It's kind of a headache. And then, of course, on your volume, you want to make sure the plus is at the top and the minus is at the bottom. Now, we've got a few other little tiny pieces in here that are going to be transferred across. I do not know exactly what some of this stuff does, but if Apple put it there, I tend to believe that they put it there for a reason. So I always carefully inspect the inside of the housing, and anything you don't see on the replacement housing, make sure you transfer it from the original. Apply some more heat here. We've got a metal piece that's going to come out, and then kind of an adhesive cushion there right above it, you'll see shortly. I wasn't really able to salvage the adhesive from this, so I went ahead and cut a new strip of 3M to just stick on the inside. So just some double-sided adhesive to stick this down. And there's the little cushion. And we got one more little piece up here at the top. Now we need to take our lock button out, and then we're going to move those other three little antenna things from the side of the housing. Go ahead and push this in from the top. And you'll notice something interesting here in just a second. And that is that little hinge that's on the lock button. There's the pin I'm talking about. The little hinge on the lock button is not on our new piece. So I cannot figure out why, but it looks like we don't need that. However, there is something that we do need to transfer from the old power button, and it is this metal disc. If you do not move this metal disc over to the new button, your button will not click. So you take some heat and a razor blade and you can pry underneath that, but you absolutely need to make sure that you move that disc over. Now this pin I don't even deal with anymore or at all. I haven't figured it out, like I said, but I found that a standard staple is almost exactly the same diameter as whatever that pin is. So if you take a staple and just kind of cut it, I didn't happen to have a pair of wire cutters on me, so you can usually bend it a few times until it breaks off, and then measure it and make sure you get it to the right length, and that will fall right into that same slot where the old pin was. You can see I just kind of took some really beat up looking channel locks there to hold on to this. Didn't have my pliers on hand either. So now we have a suitable replacement for the pin. Just drop it into this hole, and that's what's going to be holding. Oh, I'm still measuring it here. So I found out at this point exactly how much length I needed to have and just kind of bent it to mark where we want it to snap off. Hold that back in place and bend it a few times, and there you go. Now, on the volume buttons, we need to do the same thing. Make sure that you transfer these little metal discs or your buttons will not work. I would also recommend that you get this inside of the housing. This is kind of a tricky maneuver. So make sure the red tab is facing the top of the phone, or what would be the front of the phone. Set that in place. Get your volume controls in place. Just like that. Make sure these are clicking before you go too far. You don't have to pull the board out to make adjustments. And we're going to, of course, make sure that our silent buzzer button is working, moves comfortably inside the housing. And then I'm going to just tighten these down a little bit more. All right, so make sure that your silent ringer button is in what would be facing towards the back side of the phone, because that is the only way that it's going to attach to the button correctly when you put it inside. So the button, gravity is going to pull the button, the switch towards the back of the phone. You want to make sure that the switch on the cable is in that same position so that it lines up with those two little tabs on the inside. And you see that the metal bracket of the volume buttons goes in first, and then the metal bracket for the buzzer switch goes on top of them, or on top of it. All right, we'll get these screws started. I like to kind of just get each screw started individually before I tighten them up. And we want to just confirm that these are clicking before we put anything inside the phone. You don't want to have to go back in and try to adjust this, so do test everything along the way. All right, so we've got our lock button here. And what I did is I just took the pin out for now, because that way you can install this, and instead of trying to get the little hinge into place, just put everything together, drop the pin inside, and that'll lock it into position at the top. And you might have to move it around a little bit to make sure it lines up with the hole at the back end of the phone. Then we'll go ahead and put in this other screw, and of course make sure that the lock button is clicking when you press on it. Remember, we've got this little piece of adhesive foam that's going to go over this area where the hinge is located. And we want to make sure that everything that has adhesive on the back of it is stuck down to the correct position inside of the housing. Right, so there's our motor. Don't tighten these screws up because it's much easier to adjust the position of the bracket if they're not tightened down all the way. Now remember, we've got these other little pieces we need to put inside. So I'm going to speed this up quite a bit so we can just get through this real quickly. And we got one more up at the top of the right hand side. You can put that in now or later. It doesn't really matter as long as you remember. And these four little metal washer looking things, we'll go ahead and put these in before we install the charging port. And you have to be real careful not to move things around, and I would recommend that for a couple of reasons. One, you don't want these little washers to shift around before you put the charging port in. You also don't want that pin to fall out of the power button switch, so I'd recommend you keep the phone with the backside down until we get the screen put on. And this you just kind of have to work with to make sure everything slides back down into the same position it was in the original phone. I'm not sure what happened the first time I did this, but for some reason I did something funny down here at the bottom when I installed the speaker, and my screen would not close all the way at the bottom of the phone. So if you run into something like that, I'd open it back up again and re-examine the charging port. And this screw, by the way, don't put this screw in. This screw is shared with the speaker. For some reason, I apparently missed that the first time around, so we'll put that screw in much later after we've got the speaker into position. But you can put the other screws in to hold everything down for the time being. And remember, we've got this little rubber boot that needs to go over that plastic piece, otherwise no one will be able to hear you talking. And this was probably part of my problem. I believe putting that screw in, I needed to have the speaker underneath that screw. Now I see what went wrong. So don't do what I did here. This speaker does not sit in like that. That screw needed to go through this part of the plastic for the speaker assembly. So make sure you get underneath that little piece. Gets a bit distracting trying to watch your camera and do a repair at the same time. Alright, so this kind of slides underneath the logic board. That is the way that this was supposed to have gone. You can see I skipped ahead a little bit because I wanted to make sure to show you the correct position that that speaker goes in. So this is what I should have done the first time around, was to make sure that the speaker got underneath the screw and that little metal piece. So I'll jump back to where we were here in just a moment after we get this installed, but at least you can see the correct orientation for the charging port and everything that's attached to it. All right, so that's how that was supposed to have gone. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I went ahead and just pushed the cover for the flash through the old housing, and I'm going to transfer that over to the new one because the one that one of the things about these aftermarket housings is they tend to mess up on some of the small parts. This one's pretty good overall, but this little plastic piece just didn't fit, so I transferred the old one over to the new housing, and it worked out much better. You can see that little padding wanted to fall off again, so we'll set this down inside. And then this other little piece, which lines everything up with the flash. And if you get it upside down, don't worry, because there's really only one way that this fits in properly. You should be able to tell. There's the one that they sent, I believe. All right, so now we can go ahead and put the board back inside the phone. You can see I did just go ahead and take those interconnect cables off because they were annoying the heck out of me. Before we install the board, we need to make sure that we move the SIM card ejector. So there's one single screw that goes through this mechanism. If you get lucky, it might all stick to the screwdriver and you can just move it over. If not, take a look at how the wide side of the paddle is kind of towards the bottom end of the phone. There's only one direction that this is going to work, so it should look something like this, and that's going to allow you to eject your SIM card later on. Very important. Almost ready to add some adhesive to this pad. It seems to keep falling off. Right, so we can go ahead and plug the antenna in at the upper end of the board. This is the easiest way I've found to do these, is just kind of look at them from the side. That's not always possible, but when it is, it makes your life much easier. Now we need to maneuver this around that control cable, so make sure you do not trap that cable underneath the logic board. It can be a little tricky. I'll zoom out here in just a second so you can get a better view of what's going on. Right, so make sure you get the camera to lay down flat. It's a little tricky. You kind of have to mess around with this and make sure that's sitting down against the rear housing. And of course, make sure that you have not trapped your charging port or antenna wire at the bottom end of the logic board. I'm going to go ahead and put a couple screws in here just to stabilize this while we work with it. And if you didn't already notice, I left out one of those antenna deals right next to the logic board where I'm working right now, so I did have to go back and put that inside. I have omitted that from the video. I'm sure you can figure it out. But we've got a couple of screws here that hold that plate in, and then this is kind of always an awkward part, and that's getting the flash to sit inside the correct location in the housing. So you've got to crimp that little cable, the flex cable there a little bit, so that that sits down into the right spot. And make sure you get your main flex connector plugged in. You can actually plug that in over the top of the interconnect cable. I'm convinced it doesn't matter too much. And there's our non-magnetic standoff screw. A couple more down here at the bottom. And then we'll attach these two screws at the top. I have a link down in the video description for some of these parts. I cannot sell you this housing because it has an Apple on it. So I'm not going to touch that one, but if you look online, you should be able to find it. So we'll stick down the home button interface onto the charging port down here. Go ahead and plug the charging port in. Remember to reattach your interconnect cables if you have not already done so. And this fun little antenna wire, probably my least favorite. It can be tricky. I'm speeding things up here because it just took me a little while of kind of searching around. Don't force it, take your time. Eventually you'll get it to line up and it'll pop right into place. Make sure you put your interconnect cables back in. And there's only one way that these things will fit, so even if you set them aside and forget which way they were facing, I'm sure that you'll be able to figure it out. Which is something I've done before. Now you're seeing me install the display without the interconnect cables because this was from the first time around that I put the phone together. But all the same, you'll be able to see pretty much what you'll need to do to get this reinstalled. These cables can be tricky to line up. Just resist the temptation to get frustrated and force them, because if you push down too hard when you're not lined up straight, you will damage the connector, and that might prevent your phone from working at all in the future. So do be very careful with connecting those. Take your time. Patience is the key. Once you get them connected, you want to kind of keep pressure on top of this plate so that they stay plugged in. If they get disconnected at all, you're going to have touch issues, and possibly the LCD will not light up correctly or will display lines. So be really careful with that. If you run into any problems, usually removing the display and then reinstalling it will correct those problems as long as you haven't damaged the cables. You can see that little screw just keeps getting away from me because it does not stick to the driver. So I'm going to set that in place with the tweezers. Go back in and tighten it down a little bit. Make sure that plate is flat. It should not be sticking up where the battery is located. If it is, you did not engage the clip properly on the bottom end or the inside part, so make sure you do that. We'll put our retaining plate back over the battery terminal. 3 screws, and then we can close it up, and here we have what looks like an iPhone 6 mini. The last thing we'll want to do is power this up and make sure that everything is working properly. You'll need your SIM card tray and the 2 pentalobe screws on the bottom. And there you have it. If you found the video helpful, hit the like button and feel free to share it on the social network platform of your choice. Check out some of my recent repair and product review videos and visit us on the web at gocellphonerepair.com. Thanks for watching.